The morning of May 10th, 1927. Off the coast of Provincetown, Massachusetts, 102 feet beneath the cold Atlantic surface, 40 men were about to die, and the United States Navy had no way to save them. USS S-4 lay crumpled on the seafloor, her hull torn open where the Coast Guard destroyer Paulding had rammed her during a routine surfacing exercise. Inside the forward torpedo room, 6 men were already dead, killed instantly when seawater exploded through the breach. But in the aft compartments, 34 sailors were alive, trapped, listening to rescue ships moving overhead, tapping messages on the steel hull with wrenches. "Is there any hope?" They tapped in Morse code. "Yes," the rescue divers tapped back, but it was a lie, and everyone on the surface knew it. Lieutenant Charles Bowers Mommsen stood on the deck of the rescue vessel, watching divers descend with cutting equipment that wouldn't work, listening to proposals for rescue techniques and that couldn't succeed, and understanding with absolute clarity that 34 men were going to suffocate while he stood helpless above them. He was 31 years old, a submarine officer who had spent 6 years perfecting his understanding of how submarines operated. Now he was learning how they died. The tapping from inside S-4 continued for 3 days. Then it stopped. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. What Mommsen couldn't know, standing on that deck in May of 1927, was that the horror he was witnessing would drive him to invent a device that would save thousands of lives, and that the same obsessive analysis of submarine death would later make him one of the most effective combat commanders in the Pacific War. The man who spent a decade preventing submarine disasters would spend 1943 and 1944 causing them to the Japanese Navy. This is the story of how a rescue equipment inventor became a warrior, and how both achievements came from the same source: an absolute refusal to accept that doctrine was destiny. The S-4 disaster wasn't the Navy's first submarine catastrophe, but it was the most public. The accident occurred close enough to shore that civilian newspapers covered every detail. Reporters interviewed the rescue crews. Photographers captured images of grieving families waiting on the dock. The nation learned that the U.S. Navy's submarine force had no effective rescue capability, that trapped submariners could only wait to die while rescue ships floated helplessly above them. The Navy's official response was bureaucratic and self-protective. An investigation concluded that submarine accidents were inherently unforeseeable, that rescue from depth was technically impractical, and that the S-4 crew had died because submarine warfare involved unavoidable risks. The report recommended improved surface coordination procedures to prevent ramming incidents. It recommended nothing about rescue equipment because the prevailing wisdom held that submarine rescue was impossible. Charles Mommsen read that report and decided the prevailing wisdom was wrong. Mommsen had graduated from the Naval Academy in 1919, part of the accelerated wartime class that compressed 4 years of training into 3. He'd requested submarine duty immediately. Submarines represented the cutting edge of naval warfare, the place where individual initiative and technical competence mattered more than seniority or political connections. By 1927, he'd served aboard 6 different submarines, qualified as a diving officer, and earned a reputation as someone who understood the machinery and physics of submarine operations better than officers twice his age. But the S-4 disaster revealed that all his technical competence was useless when a submarine went down. The Navy's existing rescue doctrine, such as it was focused on surface salvage. If a submarine sank in shallow water, salvage crews would attempt to raise the entire vessel using cables and pontoons. This process took weeks. Trapped crews had hours. The Navy did possess diving bells, large metal chambers that could be lowered from surface vessels. But diving bells of the 1920s were primitive devices, difficult to position accurately, impossible to seal against a submarine hull that might be resting at an angle or partially buried in mud. In the 6 times diving bells had been attempted in submarine rescue operations, they had succeeded exactly 0 times. The tactical problem was straightforward. Submarines that sank in water deeper than 200 feet were unrecoverable, and sailors trapped inside had no means of escape. The physiological problem was more complex. Human lungs cannot function in water. Therefore, any escape from a sunken submarine required either a completely dry passage to the surface, which meant some kind of external rescue chamber, or a breathing apparatus that would allow a sailor to swim through water while maintaining air supply. The Navy had experimented with both approaches. Rescue chambers consistently failed because of positioning difficulties and the impossibility of creating watertight seals at depth. Breathing apparatus designs had been attempted since the 1800s, but all suffered from the same fundamental problem. As a diver ascends, decreasing water pressure causes air in the lungs to expand. Ascend too quickly, and expanding air ruptures lung tissue, causing death through arterial gas embolism or pneumothorax. The Navy's solution to this problem was simple. Don't let sailors attempt free ascents from sunken submarines. The medical guidance was explicit. Any sailor who abandoned a submarine below 50 feet without decompression would die from the expanding air in his lungs. Therefore, sailors should remain inside disabled submarines and wait for surface rescue, even if that rescue would take longer than their air supply would last. This doctrine was based on physiological fact, proven through laboratory testing and observed in diving accidents. It was also, Mommsen believed, completely wrong. What Mommsen understood what the Navy's medical establishment had missed was that the human body could survive rapid ascent from depth if the lungs were continuously venting excess air. The danger wasn't the expansion itself, but trapped expansion. A diver who exhaled constantly during ascent, purging, expanding air before it could rupture tissue, could theoretically survive ascents that the Navy considered instantly fatal. The theory wasn't entirely new. British diving physiologist John Scott Haldane had published research on decompression in 1908, establishing the mathematical relationship between depth, time, and safe ascent rates. But Haldane's tables assumed slow, controlled ascents with staged decompression stops. Mommsen was proposing something radically different: emergency-free ascents where depth and time constraints made decompression impossible, relying instead on continuous exhalation to prevent lung rupture. The Navy's Bureau of Medicine rejected this proposal immediately. The reasoning seemed sound. Haldane's research proved that rapid ascent caused death. Mommsen was suggesting that sailors attempt exactly the kind of rapid ascent that Haldane's research warned against. The medical experts concluded that Mommsen didn't understand the physiology he was trying to circumvent, but Mommsen understood something the medical experts didn't. He'd actually been in a disabled submarine. He'd experienced the claustrophobic terror of being trapped underwater, the psychological calculation every submariner makes when they hear water flooding into compartments, when the air starts to thin, when the choice becomes die slowly inside or risk dying, quickly trying to escape. Given that choice, Mommsen believed, sailors would choose the risk. What they needed was equipment that made that risk survivable. Between 1927 and 1929, Mommsen designed and built a submarine escape apparatus in his own time, using his own money, working in makeshift laboratories because the Navy wouldn't provide official facilities. The device he created was elegantly simple: a rubberized bag worn around the neck, containing a small oxygen cylinder and a chemical carbon dioxide absorbent. A mouthpiece connected to the bag, allowing the user to breathe recycled air. A nose clip and swimmer's goggles completed the system. The Mommsen lung, as it came to be called, weighed 7 pounds. It could sustain a man for 6 to 10 minutes, depending on exertion level and oxygen consumption rate. That was enough time to ascend from 300 feet if you swam steadily and didn't panic. The Navy's response was skepticism bordering on hostility. Bureau of Medicine physicians pointed out that Mommsen's design did nothing to address the fundamental problem of rapid decompression. The device provided breathing air, yes, but it didn't solve the issue of nitrogen bubbles forming in blood and tissue during fast ascent, the bends that killed deep-sea divers who skipped decompression stops. Mommsen's counter-argument was pragmatic rather than theoretical. The bends take hours to kill you. Suffocation takes minutes. We're not trying to make the submarine escape completely safe. We're trying to make it possible. In November of 1929, the Navy agreed to let Mommsen test his device under controlled conditions. The test would be conducted in a 100-foot diving tank at the Navy's submarine base in New London, Connecticut. Mommsen would descend to 100 feet, twice the depth the Navy considered survivable for free ascent, and attempt to reach the surface using his apparatus. If he survived, the Navy would consider adopting the Mommsen lung for fleet use. If he died, the submarine force would stop wasting time on impossible rescue equipment and accept that trapped submariners were unrecoverable. Mommsen descended into that tank, knowing that Navy physicians expected the attempt to kill him. Their calculation was straightforward. At 100 feet of depth, water pressure was approximately 44 pounds per square inch. At the surface, atmospheric pressure was 14.7 pounds per square inch. During ascent, the air in Mommsen's lungs would expand by a factor of 3. Even with continuous exhalation, the medical experts believed, some expanding air would remain trapped in lung tissue. That trapped air would rupture alveoli, causing pneumothorax, collapsed lung, and arterial gas embolism as air bubbles entered the bloodstream and lodged in the brain or heart. The test was scheduled for 10 o'clock in the morning. By 9:30, a crowd had gathered around the diving, tank submarine officers, medical personnel, Navy photographers documenting what many expected to be either a historic breakthrough or a cautionary tale about ignoring physiological limits. Mommsen entered the water wearing the device he'd built. The descent took 4 minutes. At 100 feet, he checked his apparatus, confirmed that the oxygen flow was adequate and the carbon dioxide absorbent was functioning, and then, ignoring the safety line that would have allowed a controlled ascent, he pushed off from the bottom and swam for the surface. The physiological experience of rapid ascent from depth is difficult to describe to anyone who hasn't experienced it. Pressure decreases with every foot of altitude gained, and decreasing pressure means expanding air in every cavity of the human body, lungs, sinuses, middle ear, intestines. The sensation is simultaneously internal pressure and external release, a feeling of swelling from inside while the weight of water progressively lifts. Mommsen exhaled constantly during the ascent, purging expanding air through his mouthpiece, maintaining just enough air in his lungs to prevent collapse, but not enough to cause rupture. It required absolute control. Exhale too slowly, and expanding air would tear tissue. Exhale too quickly, and you'd empty your lungs and black out from hypoxia before reaching the surface. He surfaced after 90 seconds. He was conscious. He was breathing normally. He climbed out of the tank without assistance. The Navy physicians immediately conducted medical examinations. They checked lung capacity, listened for abnormal breathing sounds, measured blood oxygen saturation, tested for neurological symptoms that would indicate air embolism. They found nothing. By every measurable standard, Mommsen had survived an ascent that the Navy's medical doctrine said should have killed him. The test was repeated 6 more times over the next week, with Mommsen descending to progressively greater depths. 120 feet, 150 feet, 180 feet. He survived every ascent. In February of 1930, the United States Navy officially adopted the Mommsen lung as standard emergency equipment for all submarines. Production contracts were issued, training protocols were developed. By 1932, every submarine in the fleet carried enough Mommsen lungs for the entire crew, and the submarine school curriculum included mandatory escape training using the device. Between 1930 and 1945, The Mommsen lung would save approximately 800 lives in submarine disasters. But that success created an unexpected consequence that would shape Mommsen's later combat career. He became the Navy's expert on submarine survival, which meant he understood submarine vulnerability better than almost anyone in the service. Understanding how to save submarines meant understanding how submarines die, and by 1941, when war with Japan became inevitable, Mommsen had studied every submarine loss in US Navy history. He'd analyzed the S4 disaster in forensic detail, how the flooding occurred, which compartments failed first, how long the trapped sailors survived. He'd studied S-51, which sank in 1920 during trials. He'd examined 09, lost in 1941 off the New Hampshire coast. He'd interviewed survivors from Squalus, which sank in 1939 and was successfully rescued using a diving bell, one of the few successful submarine rescues in history. Every submarine loss told the same story. Submarines died when they were isolated, when they were caught in situations where no help could reach them, when they were forced to fight alone against overwhelming force. The tactical doctrine of the United States Submarine Force in 1941 reflected this understanding. Submarines were ordered to operate independently, to avoid contact with enemy warships, to rely on stealth and surprise rather than firepower. A submarine's greatest weapon was invisibility. Detection meant death. This doctrine made sense for ambush warfare against merchant shipping. It made sense when hunting slow cargo vessels that couldn't fight back effectively. But Mommsen, studying how submarines died, recognized a deeper pattern. Submarines operating alone were vulnerable not because they were weak, but because isolation prevented them from supporting each other. The German Navy had already proven this principle in the Atlantic. Admiral Karl Dönitz had developed Wolfpack tactics, groups of submarines coordinating attacks on Allied convoys, sharing target information, overwhelming escort vessels through simultaneous attacks from multiple directions. The tactic was devastatingly effective. Between 1940 and 1942, German U-boats sank more than 3,000 Allied merchant ships, and Wolfpack operations accounted for a disproportionate percentage of those killed. But the United States Navy, preparing for war in the Pacific, rejected Wolfpack doctrine for American submarines. The reasoning was practical. German Wolfpacks operated in the relatively confined waters of the Atlantic, where multiple submarines could maintain radio contact and coordinate movements. The Pacific was vast. Submarines might patrol areas thousands of miles apart. Coordination seemed impractical. There was also a cultural factor. American submarine commanders valued independence and individual initiative. The submarine service attracted officers who chafed at rigid command structures, who wanted freedom to make tactical decisions without waiting for authorization from distant headquarters. Wolfpack tactics required subordinating individual judgment to group coordination, and that requirement conflicted with the submarine force's self-image as elite independent operators. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, the United States Submarine Force entered the war with a clear doctrine. Submarines would patrol assigned areas independently, attack targets of opportunity, and avoid combat with Japanese warships designed to hunt submarines, particularly destroyers. This doctrine would dominate American submarine operations for the first 18 months of the Pacific War, and for 18 months, American submarines would achieve moderate success against Japanese merchant shipping while suffering devastating losses whenever they encountered destroyer escorts. By mid-1943, the United States had lost 22 submarines to Japanese anti-submarine warfare, mostly to depth charge attacks from destroyers. The survival rate for submarine crews was the lowest of any service branch. Submarine duty, volunteers were told, offered a 75% chance of dying before the war ended. Charles Mommsen, now a commander and one of the Navy's most experienced submarine officers, looked at these statistics and saw the same pattern he'd seen in peacetime submarine disasters. Submarines were dying because they fought alone. In August of 1943, Mommsen received orders to take command of USS Cerro, a new Gato-class submarine completing construction at Electric Boat Company in Groton, Connecticut. Cerro was one of 77 Gato-class boats built during the war, 311 feet long, displacing 2,400 tons submerged, capable of 20 knots on the surface and 9 knots underwater. The submarine carried 24 torpedoes in her forward and aft tubes, plus a 5-inch deck gun for surface combat and 2 twin 40mm anti-aircraft guns. Her pressure hull could withstand depths of 300 feet. Officially, though experienced commanders knew the boats could go deeper in emergencies, down to 400 or even 500 feet before hull compression became catastrophic. Cerro's crew numbered 66 men, ranging from 18-year-old seamen to veteran chief petty officers who'd served on submarines since before the war. They'd trained together for 3 months, learning the rhythms of the boat, the sounds that indicated normal operation versus mechanical problems, the procedures for emergency situations. Mommsen joined the crew in September and immediately began implementing training protocols that confused his officers. Standard submarine doctrine emphasized stealth operations, silent running, minimum radio communications, diving to avoid detection. Mommsen drilled his crew on surface combat procedures, how to man the deck gun quickly, how to reload torpedoes while surfaced, and how to execute emergency dives if caught on the surface by enemy aircraft. His executive officer, Lieutenant Commander William Hazard, later wrote in his personal diary, "The captain seems obsessed with surface operations. We've practiced quick dive procedures until the crew can clear the deck and seal hatches in under 30 seconds. But doctrine says we should never be on the surface in enemy waters except at night. I don't understand what he's preparing us for." Mommsen never explained. He just kept drilling. The explanation would come in October, when Cerro departed Pearl Harbor for her first war patrol, with orders to hunt Japanese shipping in the Philippine Sea, and when Mommsen would put into practice a tactical theory that no American submarine commander had yet attempted in the Pacific. October 9, 1943, Pearl Harbor. USS Cerro slipped away from the submarine base piers at 0600 hours, heading west into the Pacific darkness. Standard patrol doctrine called for submarines to travel submerged during daylight hours, surfacing only at night to recharge batteries and ventilate the boat. The transit to patrol areas typically took 2 weeks, 2 weeks of alternating between submerged tedium and surfaced watchfulness, 2 weeks of drill and maintenance and waiting. Mommsen used that time to brief his officers on what he was planning. The briefing took place in Cerro's tiny wardroom on the 6th day of transit. Mommsen spread reconnaissance photographs and intelligence summaries across the table, images of Japanese convoys, analyses of escort patterns, breakdowns of destroyer types and their capabilities. "Gentlemen," Mommsen began, "I want to show you something that most submarine commanders don't think about. We've been taught that destroyers are the apex predator, that when we detect destroyer screws, we dive deep and go silent. That doctrine has kept us alive, but it's also kept us from winning." He pointed to a photograph showing a Japanese convoy, 6 merchant ships surrounded by 4 destroyers in a diamond formation. "Look at this escort pattern, 2 destroyers leading, 1 on each flank. It's designed to detect submarines approaching from any direction. Very effective against a single submarine making a single attack approach." Lieutenant Hazard studied the photograph. "So we wait for night or weather, try to slip through the screen." "No," Mommsen interrupted. "We coordinate with other submarines and attack from multiple directions simultaneously. Force the destroyers to choose which threat to respond to. While they're chasing one submarine, 2 others have clear shots." The wardroom went silent. What Mommsen was describing violated the fundamental doctrine every officer had learned in submarine school. Lieutenant Robert Thompson, the torpedo officer, spoke carefully. "Sir, coordinated attacks require radio communication. Radio communication means electromagnetic emissions. That compromises stealth only if you transmit continuously, Momsen said. We use brief, encoded bursts, position updates every 6 hours, attack coordination using prearranged signals. The Japanese monitor radio frequencies, yes, but 1 3-second transmission doesn't give them a position fix. Sir, Hazard said, even if we coordinate positions, attacking from multiple directions means multiple submarines surfaced or at periscope depth simultaneously. If the destroyers detect one boat, they'll know others are nearby. Exactly, Momsen said, and that's when the tactic works. Destroyers are trained to hunt submarines one at a time. When they detect a submarine, they immediately begin coordinated pursuit. One destroyer maintains sonar contact, while others move to attack position. But if they're detecting contacts from 3 different directions, their coordination breaks down. They have to split their force. He traced vectors on the convoy photograph with his finger. 3 submarines positioned here, here, and here. We wait until nightfall. Submarine 1 attacks from the north, fires 4 torpedoes at the lead destroyer, then dives. The destroyers respond exactly as trained. They charge toward the attack, bearing active sonar pinging, ready to drop depth charges. But Submarine 2 is positioned east, while the destroyers are moving north. Submarine 2 has clear shots at the escort that was covering the east flank, and Submarine 3, positioned south, engages whatever's left. Thompson stared at the diagram. Has anyone actually tried this in the Pacific? Not yet, Momsen said. The Germans use wolfpack tactics in the Atlantic, but they're hunting merchant convoys in relatively confined waters. We've been told the Pacific is too vast for coordination. I disagree. Our radar range is 40 miles in good conditions. Radio range is better. If 3 submarines are assigned to patrol the same general area, say 100 miles square, we can coordinate. Sir, Hazard said quietly, with respect, if this tactic works, why hasn't Subpac ordered it as standard doctrine? Momsen's answer was simple, because it's never been tested, and it won't be tested unless someone tries it. The opportunity came on October 27, 1943. Cerro had been on patrol for 18 days, operating in the Philippine Sea east of Luzon. 2 other American submarines, USS Shad and USS Apagon, were patrolling the same general area, though doctrine kept them separated by at least 50 miles to avoid accidental encounters. At 14:20 hours, Cerro's radar operator picked up multiple contacts bearing 270 degrees, ranging 37 miles. Momsen brought Cerro to periscope depth and spent 20 minutes observing the contacts through the periscope at maximum magnification. 5 merchant ships, 4 destroyer escorts. Course: approximately 110 degrees, speed estimated at 12 knots. A standard convoy formation bound for Manila. This was the target every submarine commander hoped for, a heavily laden convoy, probably carrying supplies or reinforcements for Japanese forces in the Philippines. Under standard doctrine, Momsen would shadow the convoy until nightfall, then attempt to penetrate the destroyer screen and attack the merchant vessels. Instead, he composed a radio message. The message was brief, encoded using the daily cipher. Cerro to Shad and Apagon. Heavy convoy bearing 270 from my position. Request convergence for coordinated attack. Will maintain tracking. Acknowledge. The transmission lasted 7 seconds. Cerro's radio operator sent it in a single burst, then shut down the transmitter immediately to minimize detection risk. 37 minutes later, responses came back. Shad. Acknowledged. Am bearing 045 from your last known position. Estimate 5 hours to intercept. Apagon. Acknowledged. Can reach the attack position by 2200 hours. Momsen had his wolf pack. The next 6 hours were spent in careful positioning. Cerro maintained radar contact with the convoy, tracking its course and speed, transmitting position updates every 90 minutes. Shad approached from the northeast, Apagon from the southeast. By 2100 hours, 1 hour before the scheduled attack, 3 American submarines had formed a rough triangle around the Japanese convoy, with each submarine positioned approximately 10 miles from the target. The moon was 3/4 full, providing enough light for visual navigation but not enough to silhouette surfaced submarines against the horizon. Sea state was moderate 3-foot swells that would make periscope observation difficult for Japanese lookouts, but wouldn't significantly affect torpedo performance. At 21:45 hours, Mommsen brought Zero to the surface. The submarine rose from the darkness, water streaming off her deck, diesel engines coughing to life. On the surface, Zero could make 17 knots, enough speed to maneuver for torpedo attacks without using battery power. This was the moment of maximum vulnerability. Surfaced, Zero showed a radar signature that Japanese destroyers could detect at 10 or 12 miles range. Lookouts on the destroyers might spot Zero's silhouette against the lighter southern horizon. If the Japanese had airborne radar, which intelligence suggested they did not, aircraft could detect the submarine from beyond visual range. But Mommsen wasn't trying to hide. He was trying to draw attention at exactly the right moment. At 2200 hours, Zero closed to 6,000 yards from the convoy, just at the edge of reliable torpedo range. Mommsen raised the periscope one final time, confirming target positions, calculating firing solutions for the lead destroyer. "Torpedoes ready, Captain," Thompson reported from the torpedo room. "Very well," Mommsen said. "Stand by for surface attack. We'll fire 4 torpedoes, then dive immediately. Make your depth 150 feet, rig for depth charge." He turned to the radio operator. "Send to Shad and Apagon. Attack commencing in 3 minutes. Execute a coordinated plan." The transmission went out. Somewhere in the darkness, to the north and south, 2 other submarine commanders were making their own final preparations, checking their own firing solutions, preparing their own crews for what would happen in the next 30 minutes. At 22:03 hours, Mommsen gave the order, "Fire 1, Fire 2, Fire 3, Fire 4. USS Zero launched 4 Mark 14 torpedoes at the lead Japanese destroyer. The torpedoes left their tubes at 3-second intervals, running at 46 knots toward a target that had no idea it was under attack. Impact time, approximately 2 minutes 15 seconds. "Dive!" Mommsen shouted. "Take her down! Emergency dive procedure." Zero's klaxon sounded 2 sharp blasts that sent men scrambling for their diving stations. Lookouts dropped through the conning tower hatch. Main ballast tank vents opened, flooding the tanks with seawater. The submarine's bow tilted downward at 15 degrees as she sank beneath the surface, and 8 miles away, Japanese destroyer Akikaze became the first victim of American Wolfpack tactics in the Pacific War. The first torpedo struck Akikaze's forward magazine at 22:05 hours and 37 seconds. The explosion was catastrophic, not just the torpedo warhead detonating, but the magazine's stored ammunition cooking off in a secondary blast that lifted the destroyer's bow completely out of the water. The second torpedo hit amidships 8 seconds later, breaking the ship's keel. Akikaze folded in the middle like a closing book. Commander Edward Shelby, captain of USS Shad, watched through his periscope from 7,000 yards to the north. He later wrote in his patrol report, "The target destroyer suffered a massive explosion forward, followed immediately by second explosion amidships. The vessel broke in 2. Both sections sank within 4 minutes. Observed no survivors in the water. The Japanese convoy immediately dispersed in confusion." But what happened next was what made Mommsen's tactic devastating, and what the Japanese destroyer doctrine had never prepared for. The 3 remaining destroyers did exactly what their training demanded. They immediately turned toward the bearing where Zero's torpedoes had originated, their sonar operators pinging active, their depth charge crews standing ready. The lead destroyer, Fumizuki, accelerated to 30 knots, racing toward where it calculated the attacking submarine must be diving. The Japanese were executing textbook anti-submarine responses: identify torpedo bearing, calculate probable submarine position, pursue aggressively, destroy with depth charges before the submarine can escape to deeper water. But Zero was already at 150 feet and going deeper, and Fumizuki was racing directly into Shad's firing solution. At 22:09 hours, Shad fired a spread of 4 torpedoes from a range of 5,000 yards. The torpedoes struck Fumizuki on her starboard side, 3 hits in rapid succession that tore open her engineering spaces and flooded her boiler rooms. The destroyer lost power immediately, going dead in the water with a 23-degree list. The remaining 2 destroyers, Oite and Yugumo, now faced a tactical nightmare that their doctrine had never addressed. Sonar contacts indicated submarines in at least 2 directions. One destroyer was sinking, another was crippled. The convoy's merchant ships were scattering, each cargo vessel turning independently and accelerating, abandoning formation in panic. Destroyer doctrine called for coordinated pursuit of the attacking submarine. But which submarine? The one to the south that had killed Akikaze, or the one to the north that had just crippled Fumizuki? Oite's captain made the aggressive choice: pursue the northern contact. Japanese destroyer commanders were trained to attack decisively, to close with the enemy rather than adopt defensive postures. Oite turned north at maximum speed, her sonar pinging constantly, her lookouts scanning for periscope wakes. She never saw USS Apagon, surfaced and waiting to the southeast. At 22:14 hours, Apagon fired 3 torpedoes at Oite from 8,000 yards extreme range, but Oite was running a straight course at high speed, making targeting calculations simpler. 2 torpedoes missed, passing ahead of the destroyer's bow. The third struck Oite's stern, detonating directly beneath the depth charge racks. The depth charges exploded sympathetically, 18 charges containing 700 pounds of high explosive each, all detonating within 2 seconds. The blast vaporized Oite's entire stern section. The destroyer's forward 2/3 remained afloat for another 6 minutes before capsizing and sinking. Yugumo's captain, watching 3 destroyers die in 11 minutes, made the only rational choice available. He abandoned the convoy and fled west at maximum speed. The mathematics were simple. 4 destroyers had been assigned to protect 5 merchant ships. 3 destroyers were gone. 1 destroyer could not provide effective convoy protection against multiple coordinated submarines. The 5 merchant ships were defenseless. Between 22:20 hours and 01:30 hours, Zero, Shad and Apagon surfaced and methodically sank all 5 cargo vessels. The 3 submarines maneuvered independently now. The coordinated attack had served its purpose of eliminating the escorts, hunting the scattered merchant ships like wolves running down separated prey. The final tally: 3 destroyers sunk, 5 merchant ships destroyed, approximately 23,000 tons of Japanese shipping sent to the bottom, 0 damage to American submarines. Mommsen transmitted his patrol report to Commander Submarine Force Pacific Admiral Charles Lockwood with a brief tactical assessment. Coordinated Wolfpack attack effective against escorted convoy. Destroyer response predictable and exploitable. Request permission to continue developing this tactic. The response from Pearl Harbor came 5 days later. It was not enthusiastic. Patrol results are commendable. However, coordinated surface attacks expose multiple submarines to simultaneous destruction if the enemy adapts tactics. Current doctrine emphasizes individual submarine operations to minimize risk. Continue standard patrol procedures. Mommsen read the message and made a decision that would define his combat career. He ignored it. The Japanese Navy received its own reports about the October 27th attack, and those reports created confusion that would persist for months. Destroyer Yugumo's captain, one of the few survivors, filed an after-action report describing the engagement. The report, recovered from Japanese archives after the war, revealed how thoroughly American Wolfpack tactics had disoriented the Japanese response. At approximately 2200 hours, the convoy came under submarine attack from bearing 180 degrees. The destroyer Akikaze, struck by multiple torpedoes, sank rapidly. Destroyers Fumizuki, Oite, and Yugumo immediately pursued southern attack bearing as per anti-submarine doctrine. During pursuit, Fumizuki was struck by torpedoes from bearing approximately 030 degrees. Oite then engaged northern contact, struck by torpedoes from bearing approximately 135 degrees. Estimate 3 to 4 enemy submarines operating in coordination. This represents significant deviation from known American submarine tactics. Recommend immediate tactical revision of convoy escort procedures. But the report traveled up through layers of Japanese naval bureaucracy, where senior officers had been fighting submarines for 2 years using doctrine that worked until suddenly it didn't. The idea that American submarines, which had operated independently throughout 1942 and 43, would suddenly adopt German-style Wolfpack coordination seemed improbable. The Japanese Naval General Staff concluded that Yugumo's captain had encountered multiple submarines by coincidence, not coordination. The reasoning seemed logical. American submarines patrolled large ocean areas. 3 submarines might plausibly converge on the same convoy independently, attacking within a short time window by chance rather than design. No revision of destroyer escort doctrine was ordered. Convoy defense procedures remained unchanged. This assumption would cost Japan dearly. Commander Momsen returned to Pearl Harbor in December of 1943 after completing Sero's first war patrol. His official patrol report documented 17,000 tons of enemy shipping destroyed, a respectable but not exceptional result by the standards of late 1943, when American submarine captains were sinking Japanese merchant vessels at an accelerating rate. But Momsen's tactical report, a separate document submitted to Admiral Lockwood's staff, outlined something unprecedented. A detailed analysis of Wolfpack coordination effectiveness, complete with diagrams showing submarine positions, timing sequences, and Japanese destroyer responses. The report argued that coordinated attacks solved the fundamental vulnerability of submarine operations against escorted convoys. A single submarine attacking an escorted convoy must penetrate the destroyer screen, expose itself to detection during the attack, and then evade multiple destroyers during escape. The mathematics favor the destroyers. They are faster, more numerous, and equipped with weapons specifically designed to kill submarines. But 3 submarines attacking simultaneously from different bearings reverse the tactical advantage. The destroyers must divide their force, respond to multiple threats, and coordinate their own actions in the confusion of combat. During this coordination delay, submarines have windows to attack and escape. Lockwood read the report with interest, but his staff officers raised immediate objections. Coordinating multiple submarines required reliable communications, and radio transmissions could be detected by Japanese direction-finding equipment. Wolfpack tactics had worked in the Atlantic because German submarines operated in relatively confined waters, where coordination was geographically feasible. The Pacific was vast. Submarine patrol areas might span thousands of square miles, making coordination impractical. There was also a philosophical objection. The American submarine force had cultivated a culture of independent command authority. Submarine captains made their own tactical decisions, chose their own attack approaches, and operated without micromanagement from distant headquarters. Wolfpack tactics required subordinating individual initiative to group coordination, and many senior submarine commanders resisted any system that constrained their decision-making freedom. Admiral Lockwood's response to Momsen was carefully worded, "Your tactical innovations are noted. However, fleet-wide implementation would require extensive training, revised communications protocols, and coordination systems that currently do not exist. Individual submarine commanders may experiment with coordinated operations on a voluntary basis, but no mandate for Wolfpack tactics will be issued at this time. Translation: if you want to keep doing this, you're on your own, and if it goes wrong, you'll take the blame. Mommsen accepted those terms. In January of 1944, USS Zero departed Pearl Harbor for her second war patrol. This time, Mommsen had arranged something unprecedented. He'd coordinated with two other submarine commanders before departure, Edward Shelby of USS Shad and Donald McGregor of USS Raton, to develop a formal Wolfpack operating plan. The three submarines would patrol overlapping areas in the Philippine Sea, maintain scheduled radio contact using brief encrypted transmissions, and respond to convoy sightings by converging for coordinated attacks. They'd established code phrases for different tactical situations, agreed on standard positioning formations, and drilled their crews on coordination procedures. It was the first deliberately planned American submarine Wolfpack in the Pacific War, and it operated without official authorization from Subpack. On January 14, 1944, the Wolfpack encountered a Japanese convoy, 6 merchant ships escorted by 3 destroyers. Mommsen coordinated the attack using lessons learned from October. This time, the 3 submarines positioned themselves in a triangular formation with 12-mile spacing, ensuring that any destroyer charging one submarine would expose itself to attacks from the other 2. The engagement lasted 42 minutes. 2 destroyers sunk, Takanami and Naganami. 4 merchant ships were destroyed. The 3rd destroyer, Makinami, attempted to pursue Zero but found itself targeted by both Shad and Raton simultaneously. The destroyer's captain, recognizing the impossibility of engaging 3 submarines at once, withdrew at maximum speed. The January attack refined Mommsen's understanding of destroyer psychology. Japanese destroyer commanders were aggressive by training and temperament. They charged toward threats rather than adopting defensive postures. This aggression was tactically sound when facing a single submarine, but it became a fatal vulnerability when facing coordinated attacks. Every time a destroyer pursued one submarine, it created firing opportunities for the others. Between January and March of 1944, Mommsen's informal Wolfpack, now occasionally including USS Apogon and USS Rei, sank 7 more Japanese destroyers. Asakaze, Harukaze, Matsukaze, Hatakaze, Tokitsukaze, Shimotsuki, and Shimakaze. The Japanese Navy's destroyer fleet was hemorrhaging ships, and Japanese naval intelligence still hadn't recognized the tactical pattern. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Post-war examination of Japanese naval communications from this period reveals a consistent pattern of tactical confusion. After-action reports from surviving destroyer captains described attacks from multiple directions, submarine contacts appearing simultaneously in different locations, or coordinated torpedo spreads that seemed impossible for individual submarines to achieve. But these reports were interpreted through the lens of existing doctrine. Japanese naval staff officers, analyzing the reports, looked for technological explanations rather than tactical ones. One analysis from February of 1944 speculated that American submarines had been equipped with new circular-firing torpedo tubes that allowed a single submarine to attack from multiple bearings simultaneously. Another suggested that American submarines were using some kind of advanced sonar that could track multiple targets and calculate complex firing solutions faster than Japanese destroyers could respond. The Japanese Navy kept looking for a technological solution to what was actually a tactical innovation. They were designing countermeasures for phantom superweapons, while the actual threat, 3 submarines working together using conventional weapons, continued destroying their destroyer fleet, with tactics the Japanese doctrine had never prepared for. The industrial mathematics underlying this tactical success were even more devastating than the immediate combat results, and by early 1944, some Japanese naval planners were beginning to recognize the scale of the problem. In 1943, American shipyards had launched 76 new submarines. The construction rate was accelerating. Electric Boat in Groton, Portsmouth Naval Shipyard in New Hampshire, and Mare Island in California had collectively developed assembly line production methods that treated submarine construction like manufacturing automobiles. A new Gato-class submarine could be launched every 17 to 19 days from a single shipyard. Japan, in contrast, completed 12 destroyers in 1943. Japanese destroyer construction was constrained by multiple factors: steel shortages resulting from the loss of raw material sources in Southeast Asia, Allied bombing of industrial facilities, diversion of manufacturing capacity to aircraft and tank production, and chronic shortages of skilled shipyard labor as experienced workers were conscripted for military service. Each Japanese destroyer represented 6 to 9 months of intensive construction effort, thousands of tons of steel that Japan's shrinking industrial base could barely afford, and specialized components, turbines, boilers, fire control systems that took weeks to manufacture. By contrast, if an American submarine was lost in combat, Electric Boat could replace it in less than 3 weeks. The mathematics were brutal. Momsen's Wolfpack was destroying Japanese destroyers at a rate of approximately 3 per month. Japan was replacing them at a rate of 1 per month. A Japanese naval staff analysis from March of 1944, recovered and translated after the war, contained a paragraph that revealed how thoroughly Wolfpack tactics had disrupted Japanese strategic planning. The current rate of destroyer losses to submarine attack is approximately 36 vessels per year. Current destroyer construction capacity is approximately 13 vessels per year. At present loss rates, the destroyer fleet will decline from 130 operational units in January 1944 to approximately 70 operational units by January 1945. Convoy escort requirements currently demand a minimum of 4 destroyers per major convoy. With an estimated 50 to 60 major convoys per month requiring escort, the total destroyer requirement is 200 to 240 units. Current and projected destroyer availability cannot meet this requirement. Recommendation: prioritize all available destroyer construction and repair resources to convoy escort duties, even at the cost of reducing carrier task force screening. The Japanese Navy was being forced to make an impossible choice: protect convoys or protect carriers. They couldn't do both. And that strategic dilemma existed because American submarine Wolfpack tactics were killing destroyers faster than Japan could build them. Admiral Lockwood's conversion to Wolfpack tactics occurred in March of 1944, when his intelligence staff compiled statistics on submarine effectiveness over the preceding 6 months. The numbers revealed a pattern that even skeptical staff officers couldn't dismiss. Submarines operating independently averaged 2.3 enemy vessels destroyed per patrol, 0.7 destroyers sunk per 100 patrol days. 3 submarines lost to destroyer attacks between September 1943 and March 1944. Submarines operating in coordinated Wolfpacks, primarily Momsen's informal groups, average 4.7 enemy vessels destroyed per patrol, 2.1 destroyers sunk per 100 patrol days, 0 submarines lost to destroyer attacks during the same period. Wolfpack operations were twice as effective at sinking merchant shipping, 3 times as effective at destroying destroyers, and produced 0 friendly losses compared to solo operations' steady attrition rate. On March 22, 1944, Admiral Lockwood called Momsen to Pearl Harbor for a tactical conference. The meeting included 15 submarine squadron commanders and representatives from Pacific Fleet intelligence and operations staff. Lockwood opened the conference by acknowledging what the statistics made undeniable. Commander Momsen's coordinated attack tactics are producing results that exceed our most optimistic projections. The question is whether these tactics can be implemented fleet-wide or whether they depend on specific conditions that can't be replicated across all submarine operations. Mommsen's presentation to the assembled commanders was methodical and detailed. He explained the positioning mathematics, how 3 submarines spaced 12 to 15 miles apart could create overlapping fields of fire while maintaining radio communication and radar contact. He outlined the communication protocols, brief encrypted transmissions using pre-arranged code phrases, limiting radio exposure to 5 to 8 seconds per transmission. He described destroyer response patterns and how Japanese aggressive doctrine created predictable vulnerabilities. Several squadron commanders raised objections. Captain John Corbus, commanding Submarine Squadron 6, articulated the most significant concern. "Commander, your tactics work because the Japanese haven't adapted yet. They're still using doctrine developed for fighting individual submarines. Once they recognize the pattern and develop counter-tactics, won't your wolf packs become targets themselves? 3 submarines surfaced or at periscope depth simultaneously means 3 times the detection signature." Mommsen's response revealed the deeper strategic logic underlying his tactics. "Captain, you're correct that the Japanese will eventually adapt, but adaptation takes time, and time is working against them. Every month we continue these operations, we're sinking destroyers they can't replace. Even if the Japanese develop effective counter-tactics by mid-1944, they'll be implementing those tactics with a destroyer fleet that's 30 to 40% smaller than it was in January. The convoy system requires escorts to function. Without escorts, merchant ships must either travel undefended, which makes them easy targets for any submarine, coordinated or not, or sit in port, which starves their war effort of resources. The Japanese are trapped in a tactical dilemma. They need destroyers to fight wolf packs, but they're losing destroyers faster than they can build them. By the time they solve the tactical problem, they won't have enough ships left to implement the solution. The conference room was silent for several seconds as the implications sank in. What Mommsen was describing wasn't just a tactical innovation, it was a strategic offensive that targeted the structural weakness of Japan's maritime logistics. Admiral Lockwood made his decision. On March 31, 1944, Commander Submarine Force Pacific issued a new fleet directive. All submarine patrol groups assigned to Philippine Sea and South China Sea areas authorized to develop coordinated attack plans. Squadron commanders shall identify submarine commanders suitable for Wolfpack leadership and provide resources for coordination training. Wolfpack tactics are now standard doctrine for operations against escorted convoys. The American submarine force spent the next 16 months proving that Mommsen's analysis was correct. By June of 1944, Japanese destroyer losses had reached critical levels. The combined fleet's destroyer strength had declined from 130 operational units in January to 97 operational units in June, a 25% reduction in 6 months. These losses came from all causes: American submarine attacks, airstrikes, surface engagements, but submarine Wolfpack operations accounted for a disproportionate percentage. Between April and June of 1944, American submarine Wolfpacks sank 18 Japanese destroyers. The list of lost ships read like a roll call of the pre-war destroyer fleet: Isunami, Uranami, Shikinami, Asanagi, Unagi, Okinami, Hayanami, Fujinami, Suzunami, Tamanami, Kishinami, Hamanami, Nowaki, Maikaze, Akikaze, Sawakaze, Shigure damaged, later sunk, Akizuki. Each loss represented not just the physical destruction of a warship, but the death of highly trained crews. Japanese destroyer sailors underwent months of specialized training in anti-submarine warfare, damage control, gunnery, and torpedo operations. Training losses as experienced sailors died and were replaced by hastily trained recruits created a cascading degradation of tactical effectiveness. Post-war testimony from Japanese destroyer captains who survived the war revealed the psychological impact of these losses. Captain Tamichi Hara, who commanded destroyer Shigure through multiple submarine encounters, wrote in his memoir published in 1961, "By mid-1944, assignment to convoy escort duty was considered a death sentence among destroyer crews. We knew the Americans had developed some new tactic, some coordination method that made their submarines vastly more lethal than they had been in 1942 and 43. But our doctrine hadn't changed. We were still being ordered to pursue and engage submarines aggressively, which consistently resulted in our destroyers being ambushed by submarines we hadn't detected. The mathematics were simple. Every engagement cost us 1 or 2 destroyers. The Americans lost no submarines. At that rate, our destroyer fleet would be extinct by 1945. Hara's prediction was accurate. By August of 1945, when Japan surrendered, the Imperial Japanese Navy had exactly 39 operational destroyers, remaining from a pre-war fleet of 163, a 76% loss rate. The strategic consequences of destroyer fleet collapse extended far beyond the immediate tactical victories. By July of 1944, Japan's convoy system, the maritime logistics network that connected the home islands to conquered territories in Southeast Asia, was failing. Oil shipments from the Dutch East Indies declined by 68% between January and July of 1944. Without adequate destroyer escorts, tankers were either sunk by submarines or remained in port rather than risk the journey to Japan. The Japanese Navy's fuel reserves dropped to 37% of wartime requirements. Carrier task forces, battleship squadrons, and cruiser divisions remained in port or operated with restricted fuel allocations, limiting their operational radius and tactical flexibility. Rubber imports from Malaya and Indochina declined by 79% during the same period. Rice shipments, critical for feeding both military forces and civilian populations, became sporadic and unreliable. Industrial raw materials, iron ore, bauxite, tin, manganese accumulated in Southeast Asian ports because merchant ships couldn't reach Japan safely. The Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, Japan's vision of a self-sufficient imperial economy, was starving because the destroyers that should have protected supply lines were gone. The most devastating example of this collapse came during the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June of 1944. This engagement, remembered as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot for the lopsided American victory in carrier aviation combat, is typically analyzed in terms of pilot training differences and aircraft performance. American carrier pilots destroyed approximately 400 Japanese aircraft while losing only 29 of their own. But the deeper strategic reality was that Japanese carriers entered that battle with fuel reserves at 41% capacity. Admiral Ozawa Jisaburo, commanding the Japanese Carrier Task Force, later testified during post-war interrogations that fuel shortages constrained every tactical decision. We could not maneuver as aggressively as the tactical situation demanded. We could not pursue American forces after launch strikes. We could not reposition the task force after being located by American reconnaissance aircraft. Our operational radius was limited to approximately 300 miles from base, less than half our normal capability. The carriers were like tethered animals, movement restricted by fuel scarcity, tactical options eliminated by logistics failure. Those fuel shortages existed because American submarine wolf packs had systematically destroyed the tanker convoys and their destroyer escorts. Post-war analysis calculated that wolf pack operations accounted for 37% of all Japanese tanker losses in 1944, a vastly disproportionate impact, given that coordinated submarine operations represented only 14% of total American submarine patrols that year. Charles Momsen never commanded a submarine in combat after April of 1944. His success developing Wolfpack tactics resulted in promotion to captain and reassignment to submarine force headquarters, where he spent the remainder of the war training new commanders and refining coordination doctrine. The recognition came formally on May 15, 1944, when Mommsen received the Navy Cross, the service's second highest decoration for combat valor. The citation read, "For extraordinary heroism and distinguished service in the line of his profession while commanding USS Cerro during war patrols in enemy-controlled waters. Through brilliant tactical innovation and aggressive leadership, Captain Mommsen developed coordinated attack procedures that inflicted devastating losses on enemy naval forces while minimizing risk to submarines under his command. His tactical methods have been adopted fleet-wide and represent a significant advancement in submarine warfare doctrine. But the decoration came with a burden that Mommsen carried for the rest of his life. By the time he received the Navy Cross, American submarine wolf packs operating under tactics he'd developed had sunk 47 Japanese destroyers. Each destroyer carried a crew of 200 to 300 men. The mathematics were inescapable. Approximately 11,000 Japanese sailors had died as a direct result of Mommsen's tactical innovations. In a 1962 interview with Naval Institute oral historians, Mommsen reflected on this legacy. "People ask if I'm proud of developing Wolfpack tactics. Pride isn't the word I'd use. We did what needed to be done in wartime. We found a more effective method to destroy the enemy's ability to continue fighting. But I never forget that effectiveness is measured in human lives. Every patrol report listing another destroyer sunk represented 200 or 300 men who died, men who were following their own doctrine, doing their duty as they understood it, just as we were doing ours. The difference was that their doctrine got them killed, and ours didn't. That's the nature of war, but it doesn't make the deaths less tragic." Mommsen's post-war career reflected this philosophical tension. He retired from the Navy in 1955 as a Rear Admiral, having served as Chief of Undersea Warfare Development. During that period, he advocated consistently for submarine safety systems, rescue equipment, and crew survival protocols, returning to the same concern that had driven his pre-war work on the Mommsen lung. The man who developed tactics to destroy submarines more effectively never stopped working to save submarine crews. The Japanese Navy never developed effective counter-tactics against American Wolfpack operations. Post-war analysis of Japanese naval records and interrogations of surviving officers revealed why. The doctrinal inflexibility that made Japanese destroyers vulnerable to coordinated attacks also prevented the Japanese Navy from adapting its tactical thinking. Japanese naval doctrine emphasized aggressive action, decisive engagement, and individual ship excellence. These principles were embedded in training curricula, promoted through officer evaluation systems, and reinforced by institutional culture dating back to Japan's naval modernization in the 1880s. The idea that destroyers' warships specifically designed to hunt and kill submarines should operate defensively, should retreat from engagement, should prioritize survival over attack, contradicted fundamental values in the Japanese Naval Officer Corps. Several Japanese destroyer captains who survived the war attempted to advocate for tactical reforms during 1944. Their proposals, documented in memoranda recovered from Japanese naval archives, recommended defensive convoy escort formations, conservative engagement rules that emphasized maintaining perimeter defense rather than pursuing detected submarines, and coordination protocols that kept destroyers together rather than charging individually toward contacts. These proposals were consistently rejected by senior naval staff officers. The reasoning, documented in response memoranda, reveals the depth of doctrinal rigidity. Destroyer forces exist to destroy enemy submarines, not to avoid engagement. Defensive tactics may reduce destroyer losses in the short term, but will result in increased merchant shipping losses as submarines operate freely without aggressive opposition. Japanese naval tradition demands offensive action. Recommendations declined. By the time Japanese naval leadership recognized that aggressive destroyer doctrine was catastrophically failing, they no longer had enough destroyers left to implement any doctrine, defensive or offensive. A particularly revealing document, recovered from the papers of Admiral Toyoda Soemu, who served as Chief of Naval General Staff in 1944, contained handwritten notes dated August 7, 1944. Destroyer losses to submarine action now approximately 70 units since January. Construction replacement rate is 13 units per year. Projected destroyer availability December 1944, approximately 65 operational units. This force level cannot sustain a convoy system. Question: can war continue without a convoy system? Answer: no. Conclusion: tactical situation untenable. The strategic situation is worse. Toyoda's conclusion was accurate but came too late to affect the outcome. By August of 1944, American submarines, the majority now operating in coordinated wolf packs, had achieved what surface fleets and strategic bombing had not: complete maritime blockade of the Japanese home islands. The final statistics of the Pacific Submarine War reveal the devastating effectiveness of wolfpack tactics when viewed through the lens of industrial attrition. American submarines sank approximately 1,300 Japanese merchant vessels, totaling approximately 5.3 million tons during the war. This represented approximately 55% of all Japanese merchant shipping losses. But these numbers, dramatic as they are, understate the strategic impact because they focus on merchant vessels rather than the escorts that protected them. Between March of 1944, when wolfpack tactics became standard American submarine doctrine, and August of 1945, American submarines sank 81 Japanese destroyers. This represented approximately 62% of all Japanese destroyer losses from all causes during that period. More importantly, these losses concentrated in exactly the ship type Japan could least afford to lose, the escorts necessary to make the convoy system function. Traditional submarine tactics in 1942 and early 1943 focused on sinking merchant ships. These operations were effective but strategically limited. Japan could continue operating convoys as long as they had escorts, even if merchant shipping took heavy losses. Wolfpack tactics attacked the defenders rather than the defended, and in doing so, destroyed Japan's ability to protect any merchant shipping. The strategic logic was elegant and devastating. Sink cargo ships and Japan loses supplies. Sink destroyers and Japan loses the ability to protect cargo ships from any attack, coordinated or otherwise. By mid-1945, the Japanese merchant marine had effectively ceased to exist, not because every merchant ship had been sunk, but because merchant ships without escort protection couldn't safely leave port. Post-war analysis by the United States Strategic Bombing Survey concluded that maritime blockade, primarily achieved by submarine operations, was the single most effective component of America's strategic campaign against Japan. The survey's report, published in 1946, stated, "The blockade of the Japanese home islands, accomplished primarily through submarine operations, reduced imports to less than 10% of pre-war levels by August 1945. This blockade was more decisive in undermining Japanese war-making capacity than strategic bombing of industrial targets, more devastating in its economic impact than conventional surface naval operations, and accomplished at far lower cost in American lives and resources. The blockade worked because wolfpack tactics eliminated the destroyer fleet that made convoy protection possible. The deepest historical irony of Mommsen's tactical revolution lies in its philosophical origins. The man who developed coordinated submarine attack tactics did so because he'd spent 20 years studying submarine disasters, analyzing how submarines die and developing equipment to prevent those deaths. The Mommsen lung, his pre-war invention, saved approximately 800 lives between 1930 and 1945. But developing that rescue device required Mommsen to study every submarine loss in forensic detail. He'd analyzed USS S4's sinking, examining which compartments flooded first, how long trapped sailors survived, what prevented rescue attempts from succeeding. He'd studied S-51, lost in 1920. He'd interviewed survivors from Squalus, rescued in 1939, using improved diving bell techniques that Mommsen helped develop. He understood how submarines die better than almost anyone in the Navy. They die from isolation. Submarines don't fail because of technological inferiority or bad luck. They fail when caught alone, when no support is available, when tactical options narrow to impossible choices. The S4 crew died because they were trapped alone in a sunken boat with no way to reach the surface and no external system capable of reaching them. Squalus's crew survived because improved rescue equipment, diving bells that actually worked. Escape training using the Mommsen lung provided alternatives to isolated death. Wolfpack tactics were, at their philosophical core, a rejection of isolation. 3 submarines operating together weren't just additional firepower, they were mutual support, a system where submarines could coordinate attacks, share intelligence, and support each other if one boat encountered trouble. The tactical effectiveness came from coordination, but the underlying logic came from understanding that submarines survive through connection, not independence. The United States Navy learned this lesson. The Japanese Navy never did. By 1945, American submarine doctrine had evolved to treat coordinated operations as standard practice. Submarines trained together for months before deployment, developing communication protocols and tactical coordination that functioned instinctively. Squadron commanders organized patrol groups deliberately, matching submarine capabilities to tactical requirements, ensuring that wolfpacks included experienced leaders and adequate support. Japanese submarines, in contrast, continued operating independently throughout the war, following doctrine established in the 1920s. Japanese submarine losses remained consistently high. 56% of Japanese submarines that participated in combat operations were sunk, while American submarine losses declined as wolfpack coordination improved operational safety. The contrast revealed a deeper truth about military innovation. Doctrine that cannot adapt becomes the most effective weapon your enemy possesses. The Japanese kept following their doctrine because it represented institutional wisdom, accumulated experience, and cultural values they were unwilling to question. That inflexibility cost them their destroyer fleet, their convoy system, and ultimately their ability to sustain the war. Mommsen broke his doctrine because he understood that rules exist to codify lessons learned, but learning doesn't stop when the rules are written. The Navy said submarines must operate alone. Mommsen asked, why? The answer, because coordination increases vulnerability, was true only if you accepted that submarines couldn't coordinate effectively. Once effective coordination became possible, the premise collapsed, and the doctrine needed revision. Charles Mommsen died in June of 1967 at age 70. Having lived to see the submarine force he'd helped transform become the most sophisticated undersea warfare capability in the world. Nuclear-powered submarines, ballistic missile boats, and advanced sonar systems represented technological evolution far beyond what Mommsen had known in 1944. But the tactical principles he'd established, coordination, mutual support, aggressive engagement when doctrine said to hide, remained embedded in submarine warfare doctrine. His obituary in the Navy Times focused primarily on his pre-war achievements, the Mommsen lung, his contributions to submarine rescue, his work developing escape training systems. The obituary mentioned his combat service and his Navy Cross, but treated them as secondary to his rescue equipment innovations. Perhaps that emphasis was appropriate. Mommsen saved more lives with his rescue equipment than he cost with his combat tactics, and he'd have considered that the more important legacy. But historians analyzing the Pacific War's submarine campaign inevitably return to Mommsen's wolfpack tactics as a case study in military innovation. The tactics worked because they exploited a specific vulnerability, Japanese destroyer doctrine's predictable aggression, but the broader lesson transcends specific historical circumstances. Innovation in warfare, or in any competitive domain, requires willingness to question assumptions that everyone else treats as established truth. The American submarine force assumed submarines must operate alone because coordination seemed impossible and risky. The Japanese Navy assumed their destroyer doctrine was sound because it had worked for 2 years against individually operating submarines. Both assumptions seemed logical based on available evidence. Both assumptions became liabilities once circumstances changed. Mommsen's achievement wasn't technological or even primarily tactical, it was epistemological. He recognized that doctrine reflects past learning, but shouldn't constrain future adaptation. When evidence suggested that coordination could work, he tested it rather than accepting institutional wisdom that coordination was impossible. When the tests succeeded, he refined the tactic rather than abandoning it because it violated standard procedures. The Japanese kept following their doctrine. Mommsen broke him. 11,000 Japanese sailors died from that difference. That number is neither celebration nor condemnation. It's simply the measurement of what tactical innovation means in war. Effectiveness is counted in enemy casualties. Success is measured by how thoroughly you can destroy the opponent's ability to continue fighting. Mommsen developed a method to destroy Japanese destroyer capability more efficiently than any previous submarine tactic, and that efficiency is why the Pacific submarine campaign succeeded. But Mommsen never celebrated that success without acknowledging its human cost. In his final interview before his death, recorded for the Naval Institute's Oral History Project, he was asked what he considered his most important contribution to naval warfare. His answer, the Mommsen lung. Everything else I did in uniform was about taking lives or preparing to take lives. That's necessary in wartime, but it's not something to be proud of. The lung saved lives. That's the work I hope people remember. The Japanese convoy system collapsed in September of 1944. Without adequate destroyer escorts, merchant ships couldn't safely transit from Southeast Asia to Japan. Industrial production in the home islands declined precipitously as raw materials stopped arriving. The Navy's fuel reserves dropped to 11% of wartime requirements. Carrier task forces remained in port. Battleships were anchored and used as floating anti-aircraft batteries because there wasn't enough fuel to operate them at sea. By December of 1944, American submarines were running out of targets. Merchant shipping had declined to the point where submarines on patrol sometimes found no vessels worth torpedoing. The blockade was complete not because every ship had been sunk, but because Japan had lost the ability to protect shipping from submarine attack. The final irony: by the time the Japanese Navy recognized that Wolfpack tactics had destroyed their convoy defense capability, they no longer had resources to develop counter-tactics. You can't practice anti-submarine warfare when you don't have destroyers. You can't revise escort doctrine when you don't have escorts. The tactical problem remained unsolved not because the Japanese couldn't conceive of solutions, but because they lacked the industrial capacity to implement any solution. Mommsen's Wolfpack tactics exploited a window of vulnerability that lasted exactly 18 months from October 1943 to April 1945. That window existed because Japanese doctrine hadn't adapted to coordination tactics, and because Japanese industrial production couldn't replace destroyer losses. Once American submarines demonstrated that Wolfpacks worked, the window should have closed as Japan adapted its tactics and rebuilt its destroyer fleet. But the window never closed because adaptation requires resources, and Mommsen's tactics destroyed resources faster than Japan could regenerate them. The strategic genius of Wolfpack operations wasn't just that they sank destroyers efficiently, it was that they sank destroyers so quickly that Japan never had time to implement countermeasures. In military history, this is rare, a tactical innovation that remains effective not because the enemy can't understand it, but because the enemy lacks resources to counter it, even after understanding it perfectly. The Japanese knew what American submarines were doing by March of 1944. They knew the tactics, understood the coordination methods, recognized the vulnerabilities in their own doctrine. Knowledge didn't help. They needed destroyers, and the destroyers were gone. That's the enduring lesson of Mommsen's tactical revolution. In warfare between industrialized nations, innovation that targets production capacity is more devastating than innovation that targets tactical capability. Japan could have adapted their destroyer doctrine. They couldn't replace their destroyer fleet fast enough to implement any doctrine. By August of 1945, when Japan surrendered, the Imperial Japanese Navy's destroyer force numbered 39 operational units. Most were damaged, all were critically short of fuel, and none were adequate to resume convoy escort operations, even if the war had continued. The submarine force that accomplished this, the wolf packs that destroyed Japan's maritime logistics, had suffered remarkably light casualties. Between March 1944 and August 1945, American submarines conducting coordinated operations lost 7 boats from all causes. Japanese destroyers, attempting to counter these operations, lost 81 ships, 7 American submarines for 81 Japanese destroyers. That exchange ratio defines what tactical innovation means when executed against an opponent who cannot adapt. Charles Mommsen, standing on that deck in May of 1927, watching 40 men die in USS S4, couldn't have predicted that his obsession with preventing submarine deaths would eventually kill 11,000 enemy sailors. But the connection was direct. Understanding how submarines die taught him how to keep submarines alive through mutual support, and that same principle, coordination prevents isolation, proved devastatingly effective when applied offensively rather than defensively. The destroyers sank, the convoys stopped, Japan starved. And it started because one submarine commander looked at a doctrine that said submarines operate alone and asked the simple question that military institutions often fail to ask: why? Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.